Okay, good. So good morning, everyone. I will just continue on what Hendrik already said and add a couple of things that went into the planning of global studios at in my own department division here at Parsons since 2005. So a long time, in the last 15 years, we've been trying to figure out, in fact, how to build these global studios, a global urban or global design studio, into the regular curriculum. For many of us who teach in the programs that do not have unlimited amounts of funding and cash laying on the side and cannot pay for students to travel around the world, much of that work also included actually grant writing and funding applications for financing this project. But one of the areas I wanted to share with you, and I speak in half voice because it's very early, still somewhat early for some young people here in New York City. So I'm going to bring the microphone closer. I apologize. So one of the things I wanted to share with you is years of planning as to how this, you can see here, this is faculty manuals version 1 from July 2010. And this is basically our attempt to begin to understand how this global studio will synergize with the rest of the curriculum and who will play what kind of role in terms of program directors, research chairs, faculty, and so on and so forth. So a number of different scenarios we developed as to how to do this properly and in a sustained effort. And then that planning also went for external partnerships as well, which are local, national, as well as global. One of the modalities we developed, which was beyond the architectural tourism model and the the client model and consultancy model, was a model we called learning partnerships. And the key objective of learning partnership is simply to develop local, international frameworks for the production of new urban knowledge and the new modalities of urban practice. That's pretty much the bottom line of this. So the production of new urban knowledge and figuring out how we act as urbanists in the world today, particularly, of course, now under the current situation of the global pandemic, or global pandemic, it's a contradiction, it's of pandemic. How do we develop then these partnerships? So these are some of the partnerships we developed from local to national level, and figuring out how we can actually work both with federal agencies and community-based organizations in Sunset Park or Corona Plaza, Corona Queens, for instance, but also at the global scale, where are these like-minded colleagues who, in fact, without us colonizing or being colonized or anybody being colonized, how can we, in fact, create a network with hubs for the production of new urban knowledge with like-minded colleagues, and also in very often with our alumni who are from around the world and who basically, when they go back, they get, teaching positions and research positions and so on and so forth. And so this network continuously grows. So in other words, the network is set up to, again, produce new urban knowledge, and the vehicle through which we do that is what we call the Global Urban Studio or global workshops. Now, there are a number of different modalities we have developed over the last 15 years, and some that we also did with, for example, in collaboration with Hendrik and some other colleagues in the Pearl River Delta region, are the following. And I apologize because there will be quite a few bullet points in my presentation, but I just wanted to really pull out some of the logistics and rationale for doing these global studios and how can they be done in the future. So the way we did it is because of the differences in timing, in the length of engagement during the period of a semester or two, differences in academic schedules around the world, we made a couple of decisions. First one is to partner primarily with academic partners. In other words, to find the colleagues in academia who do analogous work or similar work to the work we do here. In other words, engage to work with local communities and government agencies and so on and so forth to develop new thinking about urban issues, challenges, problems, and opportunities we all face. So once we have identified these schools and colleagues, we have tried to figure out how they organize their own semesters, how they organize their own global studios. So for example, Option one is the one where we initiate a semester-long studio work on a local assignment in New York City, let's say in Corona Plaza. And we introduce the global component, which means students do preliminary research on a site or a space or territory, culture we will, where our academic partner is situated in. Then halfway through the semester, usually literally halfway through the semester, we have a global component, global module, where we used to travel to a different country, a different place, and then do a deep dive around the work that our colleagues in that particular locality do on a shared thematic, and I will cover the shared thematics in a moment. Once we return, we continue to work on our own local problem. Now, of course, having the dispositions and awareness and attitudes that reflect, of course, the global perspective and the global context in which all of these local challenges we face are framed. And at the end, we reflect on the global component, and I will show you how. In a moment, next slide. The option two was actually to have a global module in January. This is what we did, for example, Henrik and I did last year. So global module in January, where we travel to Pearl River Delta, and then we do a semester-long project locally. We did it in Corona Plaza. And then the second one is where global component two is when our visiting partners, in this case, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, comes to the school in May, and we have another face-to-face opportunity to exchange, learn from each other, and learn how both localities, in fact, really play into larger global frameworks. And then the option three, which is the remote option that we are considering in parallel now, is to actually develop two semester-long local and global components in parallel. So say Henrik and his team is working on the red line corridor in Hong Kong, and we're working on line 7 corridor in New York. We initiate the global comparative dimension in week 1 with the workshop. We organize a shared database for comparative work, the benchmarks, the timeline, the schedules, and all of that needs to be very well coordinated, as we have done it with 6 different universities simultaneously a couple of years ago. And then organize the shared review and the work of common publication. I will show you in a moment what I mean. So for example, this is just a quick example of what Henrik and I were doing last year. We have, these are the flyers for our courses, the one in January, the one in May. And this is what I mean by publication, which is, I think, in the context of the production of new urban knowledge, this is absolutely necessary, which is to say, this is the way in which we then reflect on what has been learned and what has been produced through this experience. So for example, this publication will have an initial research, sometimes preliminary research, that then, as you can see on the picture above right here, is of course enriched once we are together, which could be remote. In this particular case was in Hong Kong and face-to-face. Design proposals, which I think in our case is a key component of this, because it actually begins to instrumentalize and activate some of the knowledge that is both learned through the process and the new knowledge produced. And then reflections, which come in 2 ways at least. One is that, if you can see here, each student actually writes a personal reflection on what they have learned, experienced, and how this basically affects their learning in the program. And then secondly, as a group, as a team, we reflect on what are the major takeaways from the course, what are the actionable insights, the key tenets, and how this is going to basically be brought into our local work. So very quickly, the real challenge for all of us has been to develop, of course, a global comparative framework, which I believe needs to be organized thematically. And the reason why I think it needs to be organized thematically is because that's the best way to transcend disciplinary boundaries. So if you want to have a cross-disciplinary and cross-collaborative and cross-cultural project, I think the best way to organize it is through shared themes, globally emerging themes. So, for example, and some of these you will find, this is some of the, there are many more, of course, but some are, for example, the universal need for public space. The second one is pandemic regimes, which is what we have been working on right now. climate change and global warming and how that affects public space production in local circumstances, changing notions and modalities of citizenship, democratic participation, the right to the city, which of course is also ideal because it already has a global agenda to the movement, right? But in some countries, we worked, for example, with 4 different universities in Brazil. The right to the city is built into the constitution in Brazil, unlike, for example, in the United States. So it begins to involve also other political and economic and other dimensions of work related to public space and public realm and public sphere, and so on and so forth. In sometimes, as we did, Henrik and I, what helps is to have something that, at least in the beginning, looks analogical. And so in this case, we have line 7 and we have the red line in Hong Kong. Both of them actually even have the almost similar length, which is irrelevant really, but it does help as one of the shared points, if you will, when you begin to build something that is shared and comparative. Students develop this as Henrik had it, and students will have it as a comparative work between Hong Kong and New York. And then some of these principles and criteria we have developed for many years is some of these things are already mentioned, like thematic frameworks. But for example, cross-cultural learning environment, what I called borrowing from Montessori system, prepared environment. In fact, an environment in which we prepare shared resources and a shared database, such as lectures and cross-disciplinary cross-cultural reader, a space for ongoing class discussions and exchange, and so on and so forth. One thing that is very important to this, particularly because on our side, I always have students from a number of different disciplines across the new school, from design, planning, architecture to transdisciplinary design, urban policy, international affairs, and so on and so forth, fine arts, and so on and so forth. It is very, very important that no specific outcome and disciplinary bound outcome and object-centered outcome is specified a priori, so that the process of learning actually can be framed so that it generates a number of different equally valuable outcomes. Who should be included? Again, a number, of course, of individuals, groups, communities. So first of all, students and researchers and faculty across the academic and professional spectra is truly, as I said before, in the university context, a cross-divisional pursuit. And then, of course, representatives of the civil society organization, the government, the independent institutions, the market sector, and so on and so forth. But also, for example, public health experts. In our case, this was obvious also to the seminars, previous seminars in this series. Experts in crime prevention and mapping, because obstacles to accessibility are very often related to crime. A public space is a product of social action, therefore obviously sociologists, psychologists, cultural specific practices and actions, therefore ethnographers, semioticians, philosophers, and so on and so forth. In closing, I will just mention these 3 out of many, which I think for this work have been very important to me. One is the propositional dimension, which of course is a characteristic of design schools because it instrumentalizes what is learned, in this case, broad urban knowledge, as a component of design activity. And that's very important. That's the key to our program, to our design-based programs, right? But it is not necessarily the key as such to all of the other collaborators who come from a variety of different disciplines. So the other dimensions, such as social and cultural dimensions, are equally important. And the reason why designing in this case, I think also plays a very important dimension, is because by actually developing propositions and developing dispositions towards propositional thinking, things are learned, phenomena, practices are uncovered and learned in ways that are not necessarily always possible through, let's say, the interviews and observations. And so you become to build together a much broader and much more comprehensive and inclusive body of knowledge than otherwise any of us would within our own disciplines. And then the discursive dimensions, there are many others, of course, social, political, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, and the discursive dimensions are also extremely important, because one of the ways in which we build knowledge in humanities and and in liberal arts, but I also believe in design is through critique. Criticism, but basically through critique. And we, of course, have in design schools, we have reviews and final reviews and midterm reviews, and we critique the work. And basically, my deep belief is that this critique is aimed at the production of knowledge and not at the providing technical tips to our students. So once we have, in the global context, we have a real opportunity to use this critique as a build-up of a global urban comparative knowledge, which I think we have tried to do, Hendrik and I, but also we have tried to do in all of our global partnerships.